Alright, gonna try to do a video outside and the wind's blowing a little bit, and I'm just hoping it doesn't mess the sound up too bad. I'm gonna be looking in Luke chapter 7 verses 11 through 17. This is a story that when I read it a couple of weeks ago, it was like I had read it for the first time. I really couldn't remember ever reading it before or hearing it, although I'm sure I have. And I couldn't remember anybody preaching on it. And it just seemed so simple at first, but the Holy Spirit really started to open this passage up to me and show me a depth and complexity of this short account, 6 verses, that's right up there with the Exodus account as far as how many different levels and ways Jesus is speaking to us at one time. I'm just going to go ahead and read it. The next day he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. As he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came up and touched the bier, and the bearer stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the dead man sat up and began to speak. And Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people." And this report about him spread through the whole of Judea and all the surrounding country. In the same way I was mentioning that, like the Exodus account demonstrates historically how God moved his people back to the land that he had swore to Abraham from Egypt, but it spiritually shows us what deliverance from sin looks like, bondage in sin. It also shows us what our lives can look like as we attempt to live with God after being delivered, after the baptism, passing through the Red Sea. It's a symbol of baptism. It's the inauguration of the Passover, which Jesus fulfills. I think it's a prophecy concerning the tribulation period. This short account is very visually demonstrative, to use a $20 word, I guess, of things that Jesus is doing in all this creation. In the really big picture, it's amazing to me that he can orchestrate events like this in time and space, and had this all planned out from before the foundation of the world. To illustrate, this is a visual image of and a prophecy of when he's coming on the last day. He's coming from Capernaum here with a group of people that are with him to a group of people that are coming out of this town called Nain, which is a word that means pleasant or like green pasture, like in Psalm 23. It's a nice place to live, and that's kind of ironic because there's everybody that ever lived there died, and this evidence of this son being carried out dead, who was old enough to be called a man but not old. He may have just turned 30, we don't know. But it's a picture of Jesus coming on the last day with his throng and the people coming to meet him, and then he raises this man from the dead, just as he will raise all his people from the dead on that day. And that's pretty awesome when I see those kind of big things that Jesus is doing and showing and prophesying, in not just with his words, but the way that he uses life and things that are happening, and even tragedy like the death of someone. In this case, the only son of a widow woman. And there's a few more things that we can see Jesus telling us in this. It's a picture of salvation. We'll look at that. It's I guess really want to just kind of zero in on the widow for a moment, because it's an illustration of Jesus' compassion and God's foreknowledge and just his incredible love for us and the way that he knows us. You know, when I read the story, like I said, it's easy just to breeze over it, and it's sure easy to breeze over what is happening to the widow here. And obviously, she's a widow. She's already lost her husband and is dealing with the pain that came with that. Now it appears that her last family member, relative in this town, now she could have family off somewhere, I don't know. I know one thing, she couldn't pick up the phone and call them and tell them what was happening to her. But it appears that this only son, who could have looked a whole lot like the father and been a reminder of that loss, is quite possibly the last relative she has in this village. And now he's died. And the reason I say that it's possibly the last person in the village is because it says, and a considerable crowd came with her from the town. It doesn't say anything about any other family members. It gives you the idea that these are all neighbors. And whereas that points to the fact that she probably was a godly woman, because if she had been wicked and her son wicked, probably nobody would have came out with her in her moment of grief. But that's kind of I should have saved that for later maybe. She's at this moment in the trial that I can't really identify with, never having lost a child. And if she's already lost her parents and her siblings, and now her husband, and now her child, and she's all alone, with the exception of her neighbors, which are trying to help, she has got to be asking questions about the very foundation of her worldview, her beliefs up until this point. Because, like I said, I believe she was a godly woman and had lived a godly life, serving her family and her community, loving them, as is illustrated by them loving her back on this day of her grief. But she's got to be wondering, is God who I think he is, or who I have thought him to be? Does he really love me? Is he really good? Is he even aware of what's happening to me? Does he know how bad I'm hurting? Does he know what he's done to me by taking everyone in my family from me, and my son, my beloved son, which it points to God's own sacrifice of Jesus. And you know, a trial's not really a trial unless it hurts, unless it causes us to check the foundation of our faith, our worldview, if you will. Unless it tests our faith, it's not really a trial. And I believe this woman was in a trial. The thing that bothers me when I read this is the fact that it's so easy for me to just pass over it, and all the times that I must have read this before, never even consider her pain or suffering. And it leads me to think about times when people have died I knew people that lost loved ones, and I feel for them to a certain extent, but I don't really feel their pain. And that scares me, that the lack of empathy and sympathy that I find in myself, the selfishness at my core, that I think a lot of times just care about what hurts me. And that bothers me. That causes me to pray and ask God to change that, because I guess Paul said, even if you have all these gifts, and if you gave everything you had to the poor, and in just totally practice religion to its fullest extent, even if you were holy, 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 not that anybody could be like God, But even if you did everything possible with your time and your body and your resources to honor God, but didn't have love, he said you'd just be like a tinkling bell. And that's what I fear. And I can see God working in my heart, teaching me how to love, but I still don't have it, and that bothers me. And if it bothers you, if you're like me, and I'm not saying you are, I guess just pray and ask God to help you learn how to love like Jesus does, and we're going to look at that. And this is what I'd like. Jesus, he doesn't just have an idea of what she's going through or the trial that she's in. He knows every thought that she's having, and before she has them. He's known her since before she was born. And I'm going to go to Psalms 139 just for a minute, just in case somebody's watching this that hasn't read this. Verse 1 says, O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain it. I can't understand how he knows me the way that he does, or how he can be everywhere and know anything, but it is wonderful. Where shall I go from your spirit, or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. It means if I could go as fast as light to the furthest part of the sea, that he would be there. I couldn't outrun him, he's already there. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not too dark to you, is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. God doesn't need light to see like I do. For you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Here he compares the mother's womb to the unknowable depths of the earth, because we cannot see. He sure couldn't, and we really can't. I mean, you can go have a sonogram, but I personally can't see what's going on in a pregnant mother's womb without totally destroying whatever process is going on there. But God sees. That's what he's saying. God is in there, in that womb, forming the baby, forming you and me. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. That means before I was born, God had all my days planned out. He knew exactly what was going to happen. He knows every thought that I'm thinking. He knows me in a way that I can't understand, because I've never known anything like he knows me. I don't even know myself the way that he knows me. And I sure have never known anybody else. That's one thing that really blows my mind. Like in, I think it's 1 Corinthians 13, 2 or 12, Paul says that, now we see dimly or darkly, like looking through a shaded glass or a blurry glass, but he says then we'll know in full. We're going to see him face to face, and we're going to know him like he knows us fully. And that is just unimaginable to me, to know God more intimately than we even know ourselves now. And this is where we go back to Luke, and we see Jesus coming from Capernaum, which is a hard day's walk. It's like on the highway, I looked at it, it's 30 miles. If you went across country, which undoubtedly he probably didn't take the highway, it might be 20 miles, but more than likely he walked to 25 miles on foot from Capernaum to meet this woman, this child of his, at the gate coming out of town. She's on her way to the cemetery outside of town to bury her last bit of pleasure and comfort in this life, I believe. And he meets her there, and he, unlike me, feels what she feels. And he has empathy for her that I can't understand. And he comes to her, and he knows the questions that she's got about him, and the questions of her faith at this time, this incredibly low time in her life. He comes to her and he says, don't cry. And he walks up and he touches the bar, and they stop, and he raises this son and gives him to the mother. And if you can imagine, it says the crowd was filled with fear, and we're like, why? But I've never seen anybody raised from the dead. If you were in a funeral and all of a sudden somebody came in like Jesus and walked down and said, arise, and that corpse got up out of the casket and started talking, asking questions. Well, how'd I get here? What are we doing? That would scare the life out of a person, I think. But I don't think the mother was scared. I think she was just overjoyed and thanking God so much. And he had answered all those questions and doubts and fears about if he really loved her. Why was all this happening? And at that moment, I'm sure from that moment on, she was more thankful for that son and more aware that he was a gift from God than she ever was before, no matter how much she had appreciated him before he died. And in that same way, Jesus is showing us that on that day when we're resurrected, when we see him for who he is, as this woman sees him now for who he is as he comes up to her, that he's displayed that he is God by raising this person from the dead. That all our doubts and fears are going to disappear. Anything that's left, any lack of faith that we have, we don't have to worry about that. God is going to do whatever it takes to reassure us and to love us the way that he has loved this woman here. Now the Son himself, if we look at him, provides a good picture of what Jesus is doing for us all the time in our helplessness. Because this son was physically dead and totally helpless or incapable of calling for Jesus' assistance. He couldn't send someone after him like the centurion the day before in Capernaum had done to heal his daughter, or his servant, I'm sorry. He was just laying there dead and done. Probably been dead a few days. And they're coming out of the city and they're going to plant him in the dirt, which I think is a visual demonstration of being dead, and then the second death would be the planting in the cemetery. But Jesus comes up after the physical death, which represents, I think, our spiritual death, the first death, our separation from God spiritually because of our sin. And he walked, like I said, the whole day to get there and raised this man from the dead, even though he didn't ask him for it. And in that same way, Jesus comes to us. You could go to Ephesians chapter 2. Jesus comes to us when we're dead in our sin, even though none of us seek Him and ask Him for it without His pursuing us. He makes the effort. He does everything He can. And He comes to us. In Ephesians 2:4 it says, "But God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which He loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved." So He comes to us and gives us life. Yeah, I think it's also worth mentioning that Jesus demonstrates His power over death, not just here, but by proving that He was not spiritually dead like we are, because He was able to raise Himself from the dead. Physical death had no actual lasting power over Jesus. He allowed it for a sign to us, for a fulfillment of every prophecy and covenant that He has made with us. He allowed Himself to be put to death, but then He raised Himself from the dead, thereby proving that unlike us who are helpless to do anything about our physical death because of our spiritual death, He was not helpless because He was never spiritually dead. And I hope you get some benefit out of this as I have. God bless you.